Hello everyone. Today we're going to take a look at a game which has been on my radar for a long time, and over the last couple of years it's been in early access. But it's just recently emerged from early access, so this seems like a good opportunity to take a look. This is Jupiter Hell. At first glance, Jupiter Hell might look like kind of a science fiction-y shooter, and in some ways it is. But in other ways it's actually more of a dungeon crawl. You have an inventory of items, which include healing items, grenades, and mods which can be applied to improve your weapons and armour and add various traits to them. The traits include things like Ripper, which does extra damage to organic enemies that have already been hurt, and things that let you reload more quickly or swap your weapons more quickly, things like that. There's also a whole list of skills which you can gain as you level up. Each time you gain a new level, you can acquire a skill from your list. And there are 3 different character classes, each with their own version of the list. There is some overlap. So one of my favourite skills, Son of a Gun, which makes you more effective with pistols, is available, I think, to all of the classes, but certainly at least 2 of them. But each class does have its own skills as well. So the Marine, which is the one I tend to use, and is the tanky, damage-dealing class, tends to have skills that focus more on improving health, improving defense, and being more dangerous. Whereas the Scout and the Technician, which are more focused on other things, have skills that lean into their specializations. The format of the game, as I said, is basically a dungeon crawl, so you're making your way through a series of levels of this space station, murdering all of the things that are there and trying to kill you. But it's not just a linear progression of levels from one to the next to the next. It has different branches, with some levels having multiple exits, so you can take a variety of routes through the game, and some of these dungeon branches are more dangerous but also more rewarding than others. It takes you through a variety of environments. I'm quite fond of the spaceport, because it actually kind of resembles a real airport. It has those passenger lounges with rows of seats in them and that kind of thing. And there are residential areas, habitation decks, which are full of potted plants and furniture. And the game does a pretty good job of evoking the kind of environment that you're meant to be in at any time. But as you progress through the game, the environments that you'll see will become more and more hellish and less just standard space station. The enemies that you'll face are also pretty demonic. You're basically a soldier who has been out patrolling and returned to this space station where you're based, but upon your return the station's defences shot you down. And when you crash landed on the station, you found that the entire place had been overrun by demonic entities of some kind. Some of them are just undead type soldiers who shoot at you with their weapons, and others are demon-like creatures that shoot fireballs at you from their chests and that kind of thing. Now this might sound a bit like Doom, and I'll come back to that later. There's a reason. Now a lot of your time in the game is going to be spent fighting. This space station is absolutely infested with things that want to eat your head. And unlike a lot of dungeon crawls, your prime form of combat is going to be firearms. It's all about the gunfights here. A lot of dungeon crawl type of games focus on the melee combat and might throw in some ranged combat here and there, but this is firefights all the way. It is possible to fight in melee, there are some melee weapons, and there are even some skills available to make those more effective. But it's really built around having firefights. To that end, it's a lot about hiding around corners and trying to bait enemies out of cover. It doesn't have chest-high walls like Gears of War, but there is a lot of standing behind pillars or piles of boxes, or hiding round corners at the edge of doorways, so that you can maximise your own chances of survivability, but enemies can do the same thing. So, at least the way that I find myself playing, you kind of pull back a lot, trying to lure enemies out into the open so that you can then quickly nip back into some cover and pop shots off at them while they're exposed. There's also another element to this hiding around corners, in that if you stay still and don't do anything but have line of sight on an enemy, your accuracy improves. So there's a bit of waiting around trying to balance how long you want to wait taking fire in order to get better accuracy. So you might wait a couple of turns to try and push that accuracy up from a mere 54% up to 89 or something. But how long do you want to keep waiting? Do you want to wait another turn after that, potentially taking hits, in order to get it up to 95? So there's quite a lot of tension here in how long you want to wait versus how much you want to go on the offensive. And this just gets more and more fraught as ammunition becomes more scarce. Early in the game, ammunition for most of your weapons is pretty plentiful. You tend to see 9mm bullets in abundance everywhere you go early on. But the further you get into the game, the more you'll find that ammunition for your favourite weapon or two might not be as easy to come by as it used to be. So in my most recent game, I mostly used an SMG for a lot of my run. And for the first chunk of the game, I was finding bullets for that everywhere. But as I got further in, 9mm ammo started to become more scarce, and I had to switch more to using a shotgun because I kept finding shotgun shells, even though I didn't really want to use the shotgun most of the time. And then I would occasionally find other things where I'd think, aha, this will substitute for my SMG. Like a chain gun uses a different kind of ammo, but then before long I ran out of bullets for that. So, although you may have a particular loadout of weapons that you favour, at some point you're going to have to ditch your favourites and just make do with whatever weapons you can find that you have ammo for. It actually works really well at maintaining tension. The environment here is very reminiscent of something like Aliens, I find. A space station infested with horrible creatures trying to kill you, and a lot of it is quite dimly lit. And that kind of undertaking really needs to feel tense, and Jupiter Hell does a good job with that. Between the need to optimise your use of cover and how scarce ammunition and healing supplies can become as the game goes on, it really does feel like a tense and kind of stressful experience. This game is a roguelike, and I use that term advisedly. It has permanent death, procedurally generated layouts, and it's turn-based. So you can't just rush around, even in the early parts of the game. You'll see that in the gameplay footage here, that I move a step at a time for the most part. Move, see if anything jumps out at me. Move again, how exposed am I? So even right from the beginning, this tension and this threat and scarcity and the need for cover makes you move with care and think about where you're positioning yourself in any room or corridor that you're in. And it becomes extra hairy when you get to the occasional level which actually has big exposed areas and just little fences that don't protect you at all instead of the usual walls. I mentioned Doom a little while ago, and I think it would be remiss of me not to remark on that here. This developer, years ago, released a traditional roguelike for free, which was themed around the classic 90s Doom games. These days it's under the name DRL, but it's themed around the 90s Doom, and has appropriate sound effects and sprite design and that kind of thing. And there's definitely a lot of resemblance between the way that game works and the way Jupiter Hell works. There's also a lot of difference, but Jupiter Hell is clearly an expansion and refinement of the model that DRL laid out. And that's why you'll notice some similarity in the setting as well. The whole concept of being a lone marine in essentially a space base infested by demonic entities, and having to battle your way through with no real objective other than surviving and getting out, is very Doom. It's also kind of Alien, and it works pretty well here. Another thing I want to mention is that the tone of the game isn't necessarily as serious as it appears. From the gameplay and the general visual presentation, it looks like a very straight-faced, kind of intense science fiction shooter. But there's quite a lot of levity delivered by the vocal performance of the main character. The main character is voiced by Mark Meer, who's best known as the voice of the male version of Commander Shepard in the Mass Effect series. But here he's doing more of a Duke Nukem impression. And this game is pretty sweary. There is a very much non-zero amount of profanity in here. But interestingly, and I think this is a nice touch from a user experience point of view, the game gives you the opportunity to turn this off. It actually has two options for this. There's the clean option and the serious option. So if you don't want all of this swearing, you can just turn on clean mode and you don't have to hear it. And similarly, if you don't like the main character's 90s action hero Duke Nukem quipping, you can turn on serious mode and you won't have to hear that either. And you can turn on both if you want none of that. It's not a big thing, and it's not something I've made use of myself, but I think it's a nice, thoughtful touch to allow people to tweak the experience to have the tone that they prefer. One other thing I want to mention is that the controller support here is really good. It's playable very much with a keyboard, but the controller works really, really well. Your movement is only in 4 directions, so the D-pad serves really well. And everything is mapped to appropriate buttons. It's easy to access your selection of weapons, it's easy to use your inventory, it's easy to view the map. It does make use of all the buttons, I think. But yeah, that works really, really well, and I actually prefer playing it with a controller. There are a lot of roguelikes that I prefer to play with a keyboard, but this works so well with the controller that that's the way I choose to play it. On that note, it's probably worth pointing out that it doesn't have mouse support. The tutorial mentions this up front, that you have to play with either keyboard or controller, no mouse. That personally doesn't bother me, because I tend to not like playing with the mouse anyway, unless it's certain kinds of games, like strategy games. But with many games, I prefer to play with either keyboard or controller. But I know that there are a number of people who like to have mouse control options, so that's something to be aware of if you're a mouse lover. The other thing, which is arguably a little bit of a drawback, although I think it's a very minor niggle, but still I feel like I should point it out, is that you can't really tell what weapon you're using visually. Now, you always have access to that information, it's displayed in the corner of the screen at all times, and you can see your character changing weapons, putting one away and getting another one out, but you're not really going to be able to see on your character model which one you're holding at any given time. It's not a major issue, because again, it has no practical effect. You can see which weapon you're using from the way it's displayed in the corner, but it would have been nice maybe if you could see more readily from your character model whether you're carrying a chain gun or a pistol, but you're not really going to be able to tell. That doesn't really bother me, and it's a very minor niggle, but it's one thing the game could arguably do a little bit better. That's about it as far as my criticisms go though. I've been having a really good time with Jupiter Hell. It's turned out to be surprisingly addictive. Every time I think I've finished with it for the day and I put down the controller, I find myself half an hour later thinking, you know, I could go for one more run actually. Jupiter Hell strikes a really good balance of being tough, but feeling doable as well. And because it's a roguelike in the classic tradition, you don't carry over any progress from one run to another. You start with a clean slate each time, which means that it's extra satisfying when you do make progress. Anytime you get further into the station or overcome an area full of enemies that has killed you previously, it's because you're playing better. It's not because you've just ground out a few meta improvements to your character. You're performing better. And for me, that's what makes roguelikes as satisfying to play as they are when they're done well. And Jupiter Hell does do it well. It also has 3 difficulty settings, if you do find that it's too hard, or too easy if you're a much better player than I am. For myself, I play it on the standard difficulty, at least so far. But it's nice to know that it does have the option to make it easier if it gets too much, or harder if I find myself mastering it. It's nice that there are 3 character classes as well. The Marine tends to be the one I use just for survivability, but I do like the fact that the Scout can see the main exits from a level on the map immediately, right off the bat from the start of the game. I haven't really used the Technician very much, but that class also has its own strengths, so it's nice that the character classes play slightly differently and emphasise different aspects of the gameplay. All of them, of course, have to be able to do well in a firefight, and since that's the main thing that you'll be doing while you're playing Jupiter Hell, I'm glad that it does such a good job with it. It's a simple system, hiding around corners, taking cover, trying to push your accuracy up by waiting and aiming, but it works really, really well, I think. It's simple enough that you're not going to have difficulty grasping it, but there's enough going on with it that it doesn't feel like a no-brainer when you're deciding how to approach a particular combat situation. You can also make use of the environments, which is both useful on a practical note, and also quite doomish. There are explosive barrels all over the place. Most levels have the odd explosive barrel, but some of them are absolutely packed with them. I think those levels are called something like volatile storage areas, and they're just wall-to-wall explosive barrels, which is good for dealing with masses of enemies, but also bad for masses of enemies dealing with you. Other levels also have different special aspects to them. You'll usually get some kind of message at the beginning of the level, if there's something special going on there. So that's Jupiter Hell. It's a turn-based roguelike, with permadeath, set in a kind of science fiction-y horror space station setting, where you will spend most of your time frantically blasting away at things with your shotgun or chain gun, and then looking around in a panic for more bullets. As I said, I've been really enjoying my time with it, and I feel no particular impulse to put it down anytime soon. So if this kind of roguelike game or turn-based science fiction shooter appeals to you at all, I can strongly recommend Jupiter Hell. I have very few criticisms of it, and the ones I have are minor niggles at best. It's a really well done game, and if you played one of the early builds of it while it was in early access, or even before that when it was being crowdfunded, it's come a long way since then. So I can very much recommend checking it out. This has been Jupiter Hell. Links to where you can buy the game will be in the description box below. Thanks for watching, as always, and I'll see you the next time. Bye for now.